Good evening and welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight as usual is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, last week we talked about the great harlot with the beginning of the economic collapse that we see on Wall Street now. Today we want to follow that up with the mark of the beast, and we want to explore that. Now, what does that really mean, the mark of the beast?
John, eventually we're going to today develop the thesis that one of the entities that are pressing toward global unity and globalism will give people a mark of enrollment. So you're either included or excluded. And the mark of the beast does that. In order to develop the real theme of the mark of the beast, we're going to look first of all at this trend toward globalism and why it's such an irreversible thing. Secondly, to try to understand who the main participants in this trend toward globalism, in order to develop the context for identifying what this mark of the beast. We believe that we can identify fairly clearly the mark of the beast. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, and so we want to attempt to do that.
All right, we want to then say that the global economic system is enticing the whole world, and it's powered by Satan. In other words, Satan's behind the whole thing, to cause the whole human community to strike at God's vessel. And by that we mean those living in Judea and Samaria and Israel, the so-called settlers, and the Christian Zionists that are supporting them. And so this eventually is going to come down to that, Ken.
Okay, so you're saying that this ingathered remnant of Jewish people to the land of Israel, plus real believers across the world, represent God's vessel of redemption, and Satan is firming up ranks, pulling the whole human community into unity in order to combat that.
Right. Actually, exactly to combat that, just because Satan is the adversary opposing what God's doing.
Okay.
God is doing that for the purposes of redemption.
So this is, we hear and read all the time about globalism, and there's never been a vote where people voted for globalism, but there seems to be an irreversible trend pushing us in that direction. And so you're indicating that the primary motivation for that is satanic, for the purposes that you indicate.
And we're going to prove that.
All right.
We'll look at that today.
Now, on a secondary level, beyond the spiritual enticement of Satan, we see, we might say, the captains of industry and banking. Now, they're particularly evident right now because of this economic crisis, but their motivation, they don't have a clue, I think, that they're being manipulated by Satan to accomplish some different goal. Their motivation is simply the acquisition of power and wealth, power and wealth, and being known throughout the world,
position,
popularity, or
right.
whatever. So the real leaders of the whole economic and industrial system is that's their quest.
Fueled by greed and power.
Yeah,
same old story. Yeah.
Without any idea that they're being manipulated. Now, how about
it goes beyond that to ordinary people?
Abraham Lincoln, I think, once said something to the effect that God must have really liked the common man because he made a lot of them.
So much of them.
So what's the motivation of the common person?
The common person embraces the system just to get to acquire more goods and the good life and things that are available to us in this age, and the ordinary person sees them on TV and wants to acquire these better goods and services. And so Christians and Jews are included in this without knowing they're a part of it either.
Let me give an example of that, John. Right at the present time, I have a fairly typical old-style cathode ray tube type television at the house, pretty good size one. I think it's a 32-inch. That to me is pretty big. And suddenly it's no good. I've got to have a thin screen, a thin model LCD, or I'm nowhere.
Nowhere.
Even though
put it up on the wall and won't take up the space.
Even though the old set gives me a perfectly good, and so there's always this enticement for more and more and more and better and better and better.
More and more.
All right.
Okay. So listen, this system has been revealed a little more now with this current crisis. We see it coming to the forefront, Ken, and
it's certainly
causing a reaction that we could see.
I think this is unusual. We're sitting at a very unusual time right now because the system normally is pretty much hidden and operating behind the scenes, and we don't really think about it. But right now, because of the financial crisis, everybody is looking at it, and we see this global economic system, every market in the world coming and going depending upon the decisions of our Congress or our administration or Secretary of Treasury Paulson or who's the Fed?
Mr. Bernanke, the Fed chairman now.
Yeah. So whatever it is, the whole world's keyed on what they're saying.
And with Mr. Bush, they're going to make some decisions here that are going to affect the whole world economically. So
just reveals the global nature of this thing.
Right.
All right.
Right. And we could see that we want to create a term here, the unholy trinity. Listen, Bible prophecy reveals that there's three entities are going to come together to force this system, and they are the beast, which we're going to discuss them in further in more detail. The beast, which is a global secular government. We have the false prophet, which would be just like the beast, some sort of governmental form that's religious in nature and that forces everybody to serve the beast. And finally, the great harlot, which is, as we discussed in last week's program, the world economic system made up of big business, banking, international corporations, and such that we're dealing with today.
Okay, so we want to look, first of all, we're going to develop we're going to read some scripture that will give us some of the characteristics of the beast. We could also, sometimes we hear him referred to as the Antichrist government, the New World Order, or the One World Government. A lot of different names, all pertaining to, and we would maintain that the Bible sets forth a very straightforward picture of a global union of this nature. And we're going to read about it, and as we read about it, look at some of the specific characteristics that
and one thing, God calls it a beast.
Yeah.
And so, he's not looking at it kindly. Let's go to Daniel 7, and we'll start in verse 23. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth. So the beast is a kingdom or a governmental form, which will be different from the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. And he will speak out against the Most High. That's important. God. Going to speak out against God. He's going to wear down the saints, in this case his people Israel, of the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations in times and law, and they will be given into his hand for a time and times and a half time. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty of dominion and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. In other words, this thing will eventually fail. I always tell people, especially people in Israel, that are under this duress, don't worry, I read the end of the book and we win.
Amen.
So this thing will have its time and deceive and do its destruction.
But God will undermine it and judge it.
Right.
All right, let's look at some of the characteristics of this beast, Antichrist government, one world government, new world order, whatever we like to call it. First of all, it is I like to use the word empire. Empire is a nation that expands beyond its own borders through economics and military forces to encompass more and more nations. And in this case, the beast government encompasses all the nations of the world. It speaks out against the Most High. It talks about blaspheming God, speaks out against the God of creation, the biblical God, the God of Israel, speaks out against them. It makes war with the saints. Now, in Daniel's days, the saints would have pertained to certainly Israel. And we like to focus particularly today on the people in Judea and Samaria, the so-called settlers, and Christian Zionists like ourselves who see that as a real instrument in the hand of God to
if we look at Revelation 13, which we're going to, verses 6 and 7 says the same thing. It's going to speak out, attack the saints. The saints in the New Testament is the church or Christian Zionists.
Sure. So we have both. You
both.
mentioned Revelation 12 and the last verse, 17, I think it is.
Right.
It specifically talks about the woman and the
those who keep the commandments and have the testimony of Jesus.
So it is exactly who it is. So now, John, where does this beast government, where does it get its authority?
Okay, so we're talking about Revelation 13 here. Let's go to this last part of verse 2 in Revelation 13. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So we're looking at the beast. It's the same description as in Daniel. And now it derives its authority and power from Satan.
Okay. Now, so we've looked at the so-called one world government or the new world order and looked at some of its characteristics. Now we want to look at this second governmental type, the so-called false prophet. And we're going to look at some of the characteristics that it has also. And so John will start us off by reading Revelation 13, 11, and 12.
Okay, and I saw another beast coming up from the earth, and it had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke as a dragon, and exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and makes the earth and those who dwell in it worship the first beast, worship and serve, same word in Hebrew, worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. So what we see is another beast, another governmental form, this one not being secular like the first one, this one being religious in nature, actually looks like the Christian church. It looks like a lamb but sounds like a dragon, so it's at a minimum apostate Christianity and more. In this case, we'd say Islam.
Yeah. I think.
Look at what's going on today.
I think it certainly today we would see it. It's inclusive of Islam, maybe centered in Islam, and inclusive of that portion of Christianity, let's say, that's willing to form an alliance with Islam.
Right.
We read today of all kinds of meetings of various Christian groups with Islamic leaders trying to hammer out some sort of understanding. And
it sounds good, but
it sounds good.
Can you make peace with Satan?
It sounds good, but yeah, they're forming an alliance with something that's obviously satanic. And so it's not going to end up being a good thing. Now, this second beast that we're talking about, and when we say beast again, we're talking about governmental form or kingdom. When we talk about the false prophet has a very specific function. And what is that, John?
Well, to enroll the whole community to serve this secular beast. And it does it by a mark. And let's look at that. Let's read verse 16 in Revelation 13. And we're talking about that second religious beast now, and he causes all the small and the great, the rich and the poor, and the free men and the slaves to be given a mark on their right hand and on their forehead. So he's enrolling the world community with a mark, and we'll define that a little further as we go along. But so that's what he's doing. He's causing everyone. He's saying that the secular government is doing actually the right thing, and everybody ought to support it.
Must support it.
Must support it. And he's a little stronger than I said.
Yeah,
you're right.
Yeah, must support it in order to
continue
ensure
with this
prosperity and security and all the things that we all like.
And anybody that don't is being
an enemy of mankind.
Right.
So that's what this mark will end up signifying.
So we want to identify this Holy Trinity now. We had the Great Harlot, which represents international commerce and banking. Now, remember, it's not the commerce that's bad. There's always been commerce. It's this international tie pulling everybody together and becoming a slave to the world power, to Satan.
Again, the power of enticement because of the offer of vastly increased wealth, prosperity, goods and services.
Right.
So everybody has a shot at the good life.
Right. The second one we're going to look at in this unholy trinity is the beast. It's a coming global government. It's not fully formed yet. We see something like the UN, but the UN never had any power to enforce whatever it was going to do. We see the coming one being a global one world government like the UN, but able to enforce its will and weaken national sovereignty
of
the other nations.
I think the national
sovereignty focus is on this.
The national sovereignty has to ebb out, has to go in
and
order for it to
come
to a position of power. And by the way, we believe that that what will precipitate this thing is just like what we're experiencing now, some sort of international global economic crisis.
People get desperate, the whole system could fall apart, and might give up their freedoms, are desperate to keep it going.
That's the rationale for the what's happening right now.
Right now. So now, then we have the false prophet, the third party in this unholy trinity. It's a coming religious federation of Islam and apostate Christianity and others, but we're focusing on those, and what we see there then is the driving force, the great harlot riding the beast, the secular government, which is the world economic system, and then we see the false prophet also forcing everybody to enroll in its philosophy.
Okay, and I want to make the point that the sequence of appearance here is that the harlot, international commerce, as we've been describing, is the driving force in this thing, and its appearance is already evident today, especially in this time of crisis. When that crisis gets worse, and we don't know that it's getting worse right now, but eventually we believe it will provide the motivation for the emergence of the so-called Antichrist one world government, and then that in turn gives rise to the false prophet who will affect the enrollment in the system. You're in or you're out.
Okay, these things may not take place right now, as Ken said. Actually, Daniel wrote about them almost 2,700 years ago, and John wrote most of the same thing as Daniel wrote 2,000 years ago. So these things are a long time cooking. God knew they were going to take place, and he's warning his people about them. Now, Ken, let's see if we can define this mark of the beast a little further.
All right, we want to look at some of the misinterpretations, or what we are convinced are misinterpretation of the mark of the beast. Years ago, we used to read about the concern that people were going to have a stamp of 666 on their forehead and on their, most people would say their right hand. Later, with more sophistication of lasers and barcodes and so on, the idea was that our identity and information would be a laser imprint on our hand and forehead.
Somehow embedded. These things, the Christian interpretation of the mark of the beast has gotten a little more sophisticated as science has developed new things, ending up today with some sort of a barcode with your complete history and maybe a GPS, so you could be located instantly under the guise of safety for children or whatever. But the interpretation from a Christian, quote unquote, Christian interpretation would be implanted on you. But Ken, I always thought Satan is a little more subtle than that.
Well, he is.
I mean, who wouldn't know that?
Yeah, Jay Leno and Letterman would make jokes about that if it was done. So that would not be subtle, and we believe that Satan is extremely subtle, and that there's a much clearer understanding of the mark of the beast than these what we would consider a misinterpretation. To get at that, we want to consider the subject of typology in the Bible. We see many different types set forth in the Bible. For example, the tabernacle in the wilderness and later the temple in Jerusalem served as a type of the ultimate, the throne of God himself and our approach to that. We have with Abraham and his descendants the requirement of physical circumcision. In the New Testament, from a spiritual standpoint, we have then circumcision of the heart, indicating spirituality. Now, we want to look specifically at the type of the mark of the beast. There is a type for it that is right along the same parallel, and it's referred to in Hebrew as tefillin. And John, if you would read about the tefillin in Deuteronomy 6.
Okay, Deuteronomy 6, I'll start in verse 4.
John, you got something on your forehead.
Yeah, I'm not trying to mock anyone. This actually, Orthodox Jews in the morning prayer put this little box on their forehead between their eyes. I'm going to read something that, one of the 4 scriptures that call for that, and the box on their hand. Now, John talks about something like this in the book of Revelation, between your eyes,
right,
on your forehead and everything. Our contention is that here in Israel, it's a physical sign, and John is talking about more spiritual sign. Let's read Deuteronomy 6. I'll start in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead, and you shall write them on the doorpost of your gates. Then it will come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of good things which you did not build.
John, you got those little boxes. What's in those?
Okay, there's 4 sections of scripture in there. From Exodus 13, 2 different sections from Deuteronomy 6.
And they affect what in your life?
Now here's the idea of an Orthodox Jewish person. The first section talks about where you came from. God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. The second section, he took them into the land of milk and honey, took them into the land of Israel. The third section, which I read, speaks of God's sovereignty and the unity of God. Jesus mentions these very scriptures in the book of Mark. And the last one talks about the kingdom of God. So a Jewish person putting these things, they may look silly to you, but every morning he's reminded that God, his allegiance, is that, all his problems can only be solved by God, and he's working towards it with God for God's solution.
All right, and again, these small boxes with the scriptures that John speaks about is attached literally to the forehead and the hand in the morning prayers. And so when we see about a sign on the forehead and the hand in the New Testament, we automatically look at these as types of what is to come, or spiritual interpretation. So when we look at that from a Christian perspective from the New Testament, we automatically have these, like with heart circumcision, that our minds are centered on God's. God is our solution.
God's plan of redemption.
God is our security. God is our provider. And in fact, we are, as with the tefillin on the hand, we are given our strength toward implementation of God's kingdom, or bringing forth His redemption in the earth. So that's the spiritual interpretation of following up the typology of the tefillin. Now, Satan, being subtle, uses a counterfeit, and so the mark of the beast is, we would conclude, is exactly the same thing, a spiritual interpretation of the tefillin, which says that your mind, or your sense of well-being, is you believe that your well-being and your prosperity is centered in this global system.
Yeah.
And in fact, you are willingly and wholeheartedly giving your strength to implement or keep that system going.
Instead of the God consciousness that God and revealed in the scriptures has the only solution to world domination by Satan and the destruction of God's creation, that only God and God alone has the solution. It's not going to come out of the so-called beast government, or the beast religious system, or the great harlot. God and God alone. So where is your confidence? Do you have a God consciousness? Listen, believers today are being deceived by Satan. They're active participants in this system, and they don't know it. Now, God is going to say at one point, just before He crushes it, come out of her. Are you going to be Lot's wife and look back? Or are you going to come out and say, God and God alone is my source?
It's a real challenge, John. We want to invite you to come out and join our newly formed Bible class studying in the book of Genesis. And there's nothing like the scriptures to fortify you and to reveal the reality of the types of things that we're talking about. And also, John is leading a group up to the land next March, is it?
March of 2009. Call in. I'll send you a brochure. Join us as we visit these people in Judea and Samaria. That's our program for today. Shalom.